The Angel of Death, unmasking Josef Mengele's hidden horrors. He didn't carry a gun, he never led soldiers into battle, he wore no medals, commanded no army, and never pulled a trigger inside a gas chamber. But Josef Mengele is still remembered as one of the most terrifying figures of the Nazi regime. Why? Because he killed with silence, with a clipboard, with a cold glance and a flick of his wrist. To the thousands arriving at Auschwitz, he was just another man in a white coat. But to the children, especially the twins, he was a nightmare that wore a smile. They called him the Angel of Death, not because he saved lives, but because he ended them in the name of science. Vivisections without anesthesia, eyes gouged and injected, limbs swapped, children sewn together, all while he took notes. What makes Mengele different, what makes him unforgettable, is not just what he did, it's how calmly he did it, with no remorse, no second thought, just a twisted vision of genetic perfection that turned a medical degree into a weapon. And the most disturbing part? He got away with all of it. Josef Mengele wasn't born a monster. He was born into money, the son of a wealthy factory owner in Bavaria. Young Josef grew up in comfort and privilege. He was intelligent, charming, and obsessed with standing out. While other boys played, he read. While others chased girls, he chased perfection. Not of himself, but of mankind. By his early 20s, Mengele held not one, but 2 doctorates. One in anthropology, the other in medicine. He wasn't just smart, he was brilliant. Respected by professors, praised by mentors, and fascinated by genetics, especially what made people different. And then came the Nazi ideology, a system that told him what he already wanted to believe, that some humans were worth more than others. To Mengele, Hitler's obsession with a master race wasn't madness, it was a scientific opportunity, a way to prove, with test tubes and scalpels, that purity could be engineered, and that the impure could be erased. So he joined the SS, not reluctantly, not out of fear, willingly, eagerly. And when war broke out, he didn't beg for a frontline position. He asked for something else, something darker. He wanted access to human test subjects. And soon, he got it. May 1943, Auschwitz-Birkenau. The air stank of smoke and fear. Trains screeched to a stop, their doors thrown open to reveal hundreds of faces. Men, women, children, all herded like cattle onto the platform. Confused, exhausted, terrified, and standing there, waiting in the middle of the chaos, was Josef Mengele. Dressed in a crisp SS uniform, clipboard in hand, he didn't shout. He didn't need to. One glance, one gesture, a flick of his wrist to the left or to the right was all it took. One direction meant forced labor, the other meant gas chambers. This process was called selection, and Mengele made it look like routine. What no one knew then was that he wasn't just deciding who lived and who died. He was also hunting, searching through the crowds for twins, dwarfs, people with unusual features, not to help them, but to experiment on them. Witnesses say he often smiled during these selections, not because he enjoyed the suffering, but because it was data. It was, quote-unquote, useful. To him, every child was a sample, every deformity a case study. And in that moment, a man who once swore the Hippocratic Oath became something else entirely, an executioner in a doctor's coat. Cold, efficient, untouched by the screams around him. That's when the nickname began, the Angel of Death. And he wore it like a title. To most Nazis, prisoners were disposable. To Josef Mengele, they were raw material.
He was obsessed with twins. Not out of compassion, but out of curiosity. Identical genetics meant perfect test cases. If one child was injected with a virus and the other wasn't, he could compare the effects. If one underwent surgery and the other didn't, he could open them both later and study the difference. And that's exactly what he did. Blood transfusions between siblings, organ removals without anesthesia, injections into the spine, the eyes, the heart. Vivisections performed not after death, but during life. Some children had limbs amputated and sewn onto their twin. Others were killed simply so their bodies could be dissected side by side. The most disturbing part? He called them my children. He smiled at them, gave them sweets. Sometimes even hugged them, right before dragging them to the lab. But twins weren't his only fascination. He handpicked dwarfs, people with birth defects, anyone who looked different. He studied eye color by injecting chemicals directly into the iris, often causing blindness. He dissected skulls, measured faces, performed forced sterilizations, all in the name of research that had no real scientific value. Every experiment, every scream, was recorded in his notes, carefully, clinically, as if pain were just another variable. And when one of the twins died, as they often did, he'd kill the other, just so he could compare their bodies. Survivors remember his boots echoing down the halls, his voice calling their names, his face expressionless as he picked his next subject. To him, Auschwitz was a laboratory, and the prisoners, they were inventory. To Josef Mengele, this was all science. a cold, clinical pursuit of knowledge. He believed he was on the front lines of a genetic revolution, proving the superiority of the Aryan race through experimentation. Every injection, every mutilation, every loss of life was a step toward a greater good. This twisted vision gave him an unshakable confidence, even pride. He saw himself not as a killer, but as a pioneer, someone carrying the burden of history on his shoulders.
Letters and documents reveal a man obsessed with data, meticulous in his record-keeping, almost detached from the human cost. The people he experimented on were cases, samples, or simply numbers. And when victims begged for mercy or screamed in agony, Mengele saw only the challenge of the experiment. This detachment was not unique, but his willingness to cross every moral boundary was rare. His colleagues noted his coldness, his refusal to acknowledge the suffering he caused. To Mengele, ethics were irrelevant. The goal justified the means. It was science without conscience. After the war ended, Josef Mengele vanished. Unlike many of his Nazi peers, he was never caught or put on trial. Instead, a network of Nazi sympathizers helped him escape Europe. His path led first to Argentina, a country with a large community of former Nazis and a government sympathetic to their cause. Mengele moved freely for years, using false identities and fake passports to avoid detection. He settled into a life of secrecy, always watching his back, always ready to flee again. When pressure increased in Argentina, he slipped across borders into Paraguay, another haven ruled by a dictatorship willing to protect him. Even the Israeli intelligence agency Mossad came close to capturing him, once missing him by mere hours. But Mengele always stayed one step ahead. His life in exile was a ghostly existence, isolated, paranoid, and haunted by his past crimes. Yet he lived comfortably, surrounded by a small circle of loyal supporters who shielded him from justice. And despite decades on the run, Mengele never showed remorse. Instead, he remained obsessed with the twisted ideas that defined his life. For decades, Josef Mengele slipped through the shadows, elusive and untouchable. Israeli Mossad agents hunted him relentlessly, coming closer than anyone else. On one occasion, they surrounded a hideout, only to find he had vanished hours before. Rumors spread of secret safe houses, coded messages, and a web of protectors that stretched across continents. But the Angel of Death remained beyond reach. His end came quietly and almost invisibly. In 1979, while swimming in Brazil, Mengele suffered what was likely a stroke and drowned. No grand capture, no public reckoning. His body was buried under a false name in a small cemetery. It wasn't until years later that forensic scientists exhumed the grave and confirmed with DNA testing that Mengele had died there, still hiding in plain sight. Justice, it seemed, had been just out of reach. For decades, many survivors of Mengele's experiments kept their stories locked away, too painful, too surreal to share. But as the years passed, a few brave voices finally emerged. Twins like Georgi Kuhn carried memories of unimaginable cruelty. They recalled the cold hospital rooms, the endless needles, the brutal surgeries without anesthesia. Kuhn lived with the scars, both visible and invisible, until his death in 2025 at the age of 93. He described Mengele not as a madman, but as a chillingly calm scientist who believed in his work, no matter the cost. Their stories remind us that behind every statistic is a human life shattered. And that the true horror wasn't just in the experiments themselves, but in the way science was twisted to justify them.
Josef Mengele died alone, hidden away in a distant land, but his legacy refuses to fade. His story is a grim reminder of how science, when stripped of ethics and fueled by hate, can become a weapon of terror. It warns us that brilliance without conscience can destroy lives on an unimaginable scale. And it forces us to ask, could such darkness ever rise again? As we remember the victims and the survivors, we owe it to them and to ourselves to never forget, because forgetting is the first step toward repeating.